let me put it to you this way. Besides everything else we spoke about with the policies and procedures, these health and safety policies procedures are no different than any other policy within your organization. That includes the HR policies, the POPI Act policies, the General Code of Conduct, all of them. They are in the same class. Now let me ask you a question, Oki. Would you just abscond from work? Randomly, I don't feel like going to work today, and then just stay at home. Would you do that? Hello and welcome back to My Safety Hub, your go-to source for all things health and safety. My name is Dylan Steyn and welcome back to our Hazard Spotlight season. Now, for this episode, we are going to continue down the common task of welding operations within the workplace, and we are joined once again here with Okert Fareem. Okert, welcome back. I trust that you are in good health and that you are ready for today's session. We had a very fruitful conversation laying the foundation in our previous episode where we spoke about this common task of welding operations, the risks, the hazards and the controls associated with that. And for today's session, I thought it fit, let's break down the entire task and look at a completed risk assessment for this task, and then we can take the conversation from there. Are you excited? What is your expectation on the quality of this risk assessment we are going to look at?
Well, I mean, that's going to be the test, right? So let's have a look-see and determine and argue and debate what would be applicable and what wouldn't be applicable. I mean, that's how you do a risk assessment after all, is you do it with a team of people. If you do it in isolation, you make assumptions, and that's where things go wrong.
Definitely. So that being said, let's get into it. Alright, Okert, so here we have the completed risk assessment for conducting a welding job in general. We spoke about some of these hazards and risks in the previous session, but as we can see, this one is complete with a variety of different scores for different hazards and risks. And if we have a look here, we have a total of 53 different hazards pertaining to this singular task. And remember, each of these hazards will have accompanying control measures as well. So let me start off by asking, do you think 53 hazards is enough for this task?
Well, I mean, it's about what's relevant and what isn't, right? If this task is being performed in an environment where these hazards are relevant and prevalent, then yes, obviously we would have to look at seriously controlling it, because if there are 54 or 53 opportunities to get hurt, there's quite a number of things that would need to be done.
Of course, yeah, and I agree with your statement, but again, 53 different sources of danger seems a bit excessive for me in regards to conducting a welding job, surely. But I think let's go through some of them and then obviously see the relevance, as you've now said. I think that this risk assessment in itself has been done in such a manner as to look at absolutely everything, asking those impossible questions, as you've mentioned previously. And that's a good thing. But let's see if this actually serves a purpose and if these hazards identified are things worth noting down. So we're not going to go through all 53 of them, but I think it is worthwhile that we look at the specific hazard categories. As we now understand, we have behavioral hazards, physical hazards. These are all categories for hazard descriptions. So let's start off again with the behavioral hazards. We looked at the improper or inadequate fire prevention in the previous video. We had some very good conversation regarding that. But let's go down a bit to the last few behavioral hazards. And as we can see, there's quite a lot. But let's look at point number 8. A behavioral hazard in the form of person is distracted or loses concentration while conducting a general welding job. Now, before we get into the risk, okay, do you feel that is a valid hazard description?
Well, I mean, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you can cause quite a few issues. So also, we've got to ask the question as to what the distraction is. So if the distraction is caused by another employee entering the area where hot work is being performed, where possibly they shouldn't be, that's another issue. So that's a general issue that in that work environment should be addressed with everybody. If the individual in question is being distracted because they're using their cell phone or they have their cell phone on them whilst they're doing the job, and maybe the phone isn't on silent, there's no policy governing the use of cell phones on the premises or in the workshop. Again, that's something that would need to be considered as well. So I think it's all about what is causing the distraction. Is it the person or the person's own behavior or their own neglect? Or is it other external factors or persons or parties that's actually causing that distraction that we would need to consider so that we can determine what to do about it?
A very valid point, and that which you're speaking of is what we call an unwanted event. Now, I always explain this way. An unwanted event is the pivot point between either an accident or an incident. The hazard statement at the very top will remain the same irrespective, because once we've foreseen something to happen, it cannot change, and the same can be said with risks. But here we have the person is distracted as the hazard. From there we have the unwanted event. That is where the momentum starts forming, and in this case the person becomes distracted or loses focus on welding activities while conducting a general welding job. That is the unwanted event. From here, this can now go one of two ways. Either to an accident, which has a measurable consequence or measurable damage, and it could also result in property damage. All accidents. From an incident perspective, the same unwanted event could occur, but the person might catch himself mid-checking his cell phone, or someone else talking to him mid-job and say, no, I'm not going to do this. And yes, that might have been a near miss, rightfully so, but it did not result in any measurable consequence. So I agree with your statement here that we need to be very specific with what the unwanted event is, because the unwanted event would need to be controlled as well. So
Yes.
in this case, it is quite broad, and I think it could be defined a bit better, but I think, in general, distracted or concentration could be looked at here. But further to that, let's now have a look at if this unwanted event turns into an accident, what would happen? So with that being said, this could then cause an incident or injury to themselves or equipment, so on and so forth, second-degree burns, possible electrical trauma, second-degree skin irritations, third-degree burns, loss of consciousness, possible electrocution, possible fatality, and possible legal liability. Do you think those are valid risks for this particular hazard?
Well, it's a welding operation. So, if I had to assume that we're doing arc welding, there's a lot of electricity present, definitely the potential to get burnt. So that's where your second and third degree burns come in. You might even think as far as saying that if you're looking at the combination between the exposure to the electrical current, plus if you consider third degree burn in the same instance as well, you may be looking at a possible fatality. So that could actually get a little bit worse, where we've got that possible fatality statement in there. Could the distraction lead to an uncontrolled fire that ignites, and we've got the entire property on fire? It's also a possibility. Distractions can cause a number of incidents.
Sure.
We've made a video on the use of cell phones in the workplace as well, which I believe will be published soon. And so again, it's that being the prophet of doom, looking into the future, and asking the question as to what the immediate environment looks like, what other substances are there, what is this distraction triggering. So absolutely, these possible consequences are all viable. They can all become realities.
Quite right, and I must agree with that, but it is quite a scary thought to think that if I get distracted while conducting this job, even being on my phone, it could result in a possible fatality. But in a very severe case, that might be true. Now, further to this, Oki, let's have a look at the scoring of this particular line item here. So remember, we score the hazard and the risk in two ways. We score it before and after control measure, and we look at the severity, how severe the injuries or the damage will be if it results in real life, and the probability that that will actually happen. Now, we need to look at this two ways. We need to look at this before control measures, which is our pure or inherent risk or hazards, and we look at this after control measures. That is what we call controlled hazards and risks. And we can see here that there's a difference between these two. But before we go into that, let me pull up the methodology here. So just to give us a better understanding of how these scores came to be. So if we look at the methodology for scoring our risk assessment, again, we have severity or probability, which is innate, the severity and probability here. And we can see, that we have this on a rating scale from 1 to 5 on both of these, which then multiply together, give us a total risk rating out of 25, which tells us innate what to do with that particular hazard or risk. So let's have a look at the severity first. And the severity, we look at keywords and the impact that specific hazard will have if you come into contact with it. The first one is a noticeable severity. These are small minor perforations, punctures, small cuts, bruises, and so forth. Your run-of-the-mill items that don't need to be attended by a physician or a doctor, normally just first aid cases, very minor at that. 2 is important. This is where the administration of first aid comes into play, where we have more minor or noticeable cuts and property damage of 100,000 Rand upwards. These are all in the second category of important severities. 3, we have very serious items, and this is again the admission of first aid, larger cuts, strains, bumps, bruises, etc. And this is also where the person would need to seek medical attention. Okay, so as soon as the person needs to seek medical attention, that will be classified as a serious severity. This is also crushing of digits and 500,000 Rand property damage upwards. Okay. Then we have very serious items. This is where a single fatality comes into play. So as soon as we have a severity or a risk description that talks about singular fatalities or possible singular fatalities, it is scored as a 4. And then the last one is a disaster. And this is where we can see multiple fatalities are present, permanent local damage to the environment or ecosystems, multiple severe injuries, third-degree burns, or off time more than 14 working days. In essence, Section 24s. Then we move on to probability, where we have how likely it is that these risks will actually occur in real life. And here we have the same 5 scale. The first one is conceivable, maybe 1 in 1,000, right? Remotely possible is less possible, maybe 1 in 100 that this will happen. So when we talk about 1 in 100, remember that 1 and 100, those are all near misses. It only takes one near miss or incident to result in that accident actually happening. So every 1 in 100 incidents will result in that accident. A 3 is unusual but possible, maybe 1 in 10 occurrences of this near miss. Likely is a 50-50 chance, and 5 is almost certain. This is like this will happen in the next few seconds if not treated immediately. Again, these two get multiplied with each other, and then we get our overall risk category or risk score out of 25. And as we can see, we have critical, high risk, substantial risks, possible, and low risks. And with each of these, we have remedial activities, such as a low risk where we monitor up until a critical risk, which is intolerable, implement and monitor control measures, and change the method or transfer the risk. We cannot have any critical items with our risk assessment. So, Oki, do you have any suggestions, any opinions on that methodology?
Well, yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to note that simply using words to describe risk is not enough, because the association that persons make to words are never aligned. So if I say that I'm tall, how tall am I? And if I say that something is dangerous, how dangerous is it?
Sure.
And that's why we use numbers, and that's why
Mm-hmm.
we have a risk scoring matrix where we associate probability with severity,
Mm-hmm.
and we can then determine and classify the level of risk. And with those numbers, and like you've indicated, the critical risk, we would understand that the higher than the value, the higher than the score,
Yeah.
the higher the number, the more intense the control towards the specific hazard would have to be.
Correct. Yes.
And if we can make those determinations, and by the use of the numbers, obviously it makes it a little bit easier for a team of health and safety individuals. So be it a health and safety officer with a health and safety committee, with managers, with supervisors, who can then together decide whether the control or level of control is adequate as it is associated to the level of risk. And then the other thing that you've mentioned, which I also find interesting and also valuable, is you've mentioned the 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 instance. And we've got to determine what is an instance. And you made mention of a near miss.
Mm-hmm.
So if I am operating a machine, which is, for example, doing spot welding,
Sure.
and I have to, by hand, even though I'm wearing gloves, hold
Mm-hmm.
a piece of material in place so that the machine can do the spot welding.
Yeah.
And I do this task or perform this activity hundreds of times in a day. Every single time that spot welding mechanism misses my finger or my
Mm-hmm.
thumb, that's a near miss.
That is a near miss. You're quite right.
So, how many times do I have to go past those near misses before the spot welder welds
Mm-hmm.
on my thumb?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important thing to think about. And in addition to that, you've got to think about probability in the sense of not only the task being performed and your general assumption or perception with regards to the probability or the chance of it actually happening or going wrong. You've got to consider the number of people performing the task,
Yes.
being exposed to the hazard again and again and again and again. And if you think about those number of persons being exposed to the number of near misses,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're looking at 20 people performing the same task, going through the same number of near misses, your probability rating has now exponentially jumped up
Yes.
because it's no longer one single person being exposed to this hazard. It's now 20 people
Yeah.
performing the task, exposing themselves to the hazard again and again and again. And now your probability rating is probably going to be quite high.
I
Something will
agree.
go wrong.
No, I fully agree. And when I present incident investigation or health and safety rep or OSHA for management training, I tell the candidates that I guarantee you, and I will put money on it, that every single person sitting in my class today has encountered a near miss at some point in time in their careers. It doesn't matter if you are a receptionist, an admin clerk, a machine operator, it does not matter. You will have an incident at some point in time. And as you now rightfully mentioned, this relates back to the probabilities that the amount of people, the amount of tasks being done, this all forms part of probability. And when we look at our methodology, we need to keep that in mind before conducting our scoring. Okay. So further to that, we have before control measures. Remember, this is our inherent or pure risk. This is when we look at the activity and the hazards associated with that activity before we've actually done anything to mitigate that, before we've trained people, before we've put up signs, etc. So we need to look at the worst case scenario here, that if we don't do anything, what is the risk level like for this particular hazard in this task? And in this matter, let's have a look here. This says the person is distracted. And this person scored it on the 4 on the severity scale, which I can agree with because here we have possible fatality or legal liability. So if I have a look at the severity on my methodology, there we can obviously see that, okay, in this line we have a single fatality, which means I need to make this one a 4 with my severity.
Yes.
Now, the likelihood, he said that this was a 3 before control measures. So before control measure, this was a 1 in 10 occurrence that if this person conducts a welding job, or any number of persons conduct a welding job, that every 1 in 10 instances, you will have a distraction taking place, which is what they say rightfully with this probability. All of that adding up to a 12, which falls into the substantial risk category, which means
Yes.
we need to implement and monitor control measures and change the method or mitigate the hazard completely, which is easier said than done. So we have the foundation now of this particular hazard. Now let's go and have a look at the controls that they've associated with this particular hazard. Okay, so again, these are some of the control measures they selected, and also some of them are suggested controls. So let's have a look here.
Right.
First off, we have an admin control in the form of an appointment letter, keeping in mind the hierarchy of controls we spoke about in the previous session: elimination, substitution, engineering, isolation, admin, PPE. Okay,
Yes.
so admin is one of the last tiers, right? And here we can have a section 8, which is good because that means that there will be a supervisor or a manager for that matter for this particular task and
Correct.
for this hazard. We have another admin control in the form of a safe operating procedure. So a very good one as well, because the SOP explains all of the hazards and the risks and the controls. Then we have an admin control in the form of training, general health and safety induction training. Sure, in the induction training, it is sometimes generic, but it does relay some of the most common hazards within that workplace. That's kind of the idea of induction. And then the last one is a behavior control in the form of fatigue management communication. That's a unique one, and I think that is good to have in this specific hazard statement and in the task in general. Before I give this back to you, Okra, just keep in mind that when we look at control measures, we are looking at control measures specific to the hazard statement. We need to allocate things that need to mitigate this hazard and not the task as a whole. Otherwise, we miss things. Okay.
That's
so that
correct.
being said, okay, what do you think about these controls selected here?
Well, having supervision, in South African legislation, we refer to a Section 8 appointment, so that would be a manager. 8.2 would be a supervisor.
Yes.
So that's pretty good. I mean, you want someone to have an eye on, this type of work. It's hot work. It's dangerous. So you want to try and prohibit others from distracting the welder.
Mhm.
So that's fine. We've got safe operating procedures, which is a necessity for all tasks. General health and safety induction training, a necessity for all employees. We won't necessarily, cover the possibility of being distracted at work in the induction training. So I'm a little bit skeptical as to how the induction training would actually affect and control risk with regards to this specific hazard, being distracted. So yeah, I'm a little bit, I'm unsure as to whether that's going to have any effect on the risk or the possibility of the incident actually happening.
Sure.
Then we've got fatigue management. Yes, I would agree. Persons that are fatigued would be more likely to, even if in their own minds,
Mhm.
drift off and not pay
Sure.
attention to what they're doing, which is also a form of distraction.
Mhm.
But I'd make other suggestions as well. I'd appoint a health and safety representative in that area. It is
Definitely.
specific for hot work to keep an eye. I'd probably include as well toolbox talks, which
Mhm.
also links up to your communication awareness, specific towards other possibilities on how I can get distracted. So let's have a toolbox talk on the use of cell phones in the workplace. Let's have a toolbox talk on horseplay in the
Yeah.
workplace, which is a no-no. And let's do a little bit of extra communication with regards to how I can get distracted and what I need to understand and know in this regard, because it can result in these possible risks and negative consequences that you've pointed out already.
Mhm.
And again, standard job safety analysis or
Yeah.
job safety observation that would need to be done. I'd also include a permit to work. In the permit itself, we can bring in additional controls where we isolate the area where I'm
Sure.
working and
Yeah.
performing the welding activity, so to
Mhm.
prohibit others from accessing the area, and therefore I cannot be distracted.
Mhm.
If I am able to eliminate most of the possible distractions, then I agree this probability rating would be a 1. As it stands here right now, I wouldn't say that the probability would go down to a 1. I'd say it'd probably be a 2 at most,
Mhm.
or at least, whichever way you want to look at it. But then I just want to ask a question, and we mentioned this in the previous recording as well. Why
Sure.
would the severity stay the same?
So let me re-explain that just for the viewers. If you are new to this video, I highly suggest watching the previous episode as well. There's a lot of information that relates to the current conversation. But nevertheless, so severity remains the same from before to after control measure, because again, once we've foreseen possible risks that are associated with that particular hazard to happen, they cannot change. They cannot alter over time. Think about it this way. If you drive on the highway and you don't put on a safety belt and you don't look directly at where you're going and you're smoking and on the cell phone, you have hazards and you have risks associated with that hazard, okay, which could result in a possible fatality. Yeah, I'm sure you all agree. So that is a fall. Now I'm safe all of a sudden because I got pulled over by the Metro Police and I put on my safety belt, I put out my cigarette, replace it for a vape maybe, I don't know. But I do all of these control measures in the hopes that I will work safer. Would all of these things mitigate or remove the risk of possible fatality? Let me put it to you this way. Can I still get into a car accident with my safety belt on, not smoking, not on my phone? Is that
Yes.
probability still there? And because that probability is still there, we cannot take the severity down. Once we've foreseen a fatality, it doesn't matter any amount of control measures, the probability of a fatality will always be there. The only thing that we do with regards to control measures is we control the hazard in its probability form. We mitigate the likelihood of it happening. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example that you've used, because I mean, if you consider, the number of road accidents that happen, across the world, many of them happen to persons that are applying the rules of the road adequately, that have been trained, they've done advanced training with operating a vehicle, they stick to the speed limit, they wear their seat belts, they're doing everything right.
Yeah.
But still they get into an accident.
And sometimes
because
it wasn't even their fault.
Exactly, because I mean, first of all, you can't control the other drivers as much as you can't control or think on behalf of other employees in the workplace.
Exactly.
You can't. You need to try and think about those instances where there might be a lack of control. So when you're driving on the road, you try and foresee, what if this person moves into my lane? What if that person doesn't halt? What if that person doesn't indicate when we get to the intersection? And you got to think ahead when you're driving. It's exactly the same thing when you're looking at a risk assessment. And the point is, even if you have all of the controls in place that we've now suggested for this specific hazard, we've got to remember that no control measure is perfect. And the reason why no control measure is perfect is because control measures are designed by people. And no person is perfect. And they would usually have, every control measure would usually have a gap or a hole in it, which is not visible, that you're not seeing, because the control measure is imperfect and you don't have enough foresight to actually try and imagine what that gap could be. And when these multiple layers of control with all of their gaps in them, because none of this is perfect. Fatigue management isn't perfect. And appointing persons to supervise isn't perfect. It's not always going to work. And there you've got the Swiss cheese model on as well. That's why you need persons of accountability with proper structure that they can use and enforce, again, in the form of policies and procedures which are applicable and relatable to these control measures that we've looked at here now.
Exactly.
So that we can consistently apply the control measure and be able to effectively review the control measure should we receive the news about the near miss. Now, obviously, we need to try and get the employees to report the near misses first and to have them understand what near misses are, which in itself is a big challenge. But if you get wind and news of these control measures and the near misses that are happening related to them as they are relatable to these hazards, it's a red flag that tells you that something's waiting for you around the corner, and that's called an accident. So
Sure.
then you use the policy and the procedure to go and review and check, do another job safety analysis, have conversations, have training sessions, and make sure that you just up it a notch. And I would actually say that if you have reports of near miss incidents that are given to you, you need to have a look at your probability score.
Well, yes, most definitely. Okay. But before we go further on the scoring, I just want to give you another side of the story here, or another opinion in this fact. You know, you spoke about the reporting of the near miss incidents and so forth, and where the policies comes to play. And here I'm going to play devil's advocate a bit. We spoke about employers always being responsible and accountable when an accident does happen, but so is the employee. Let me put it to you this way. Besides everything else we spoke about with the policies and procedures, these health and safety policies procedures are no different than any other policy within your organization. That includes the HR policies, the POPI Act policies, the General Code of Conduct, all of them. They are in the same class. Now let me ask you a question, okay? Would you just abscond from work? Randomly, I don't feel like going to work today, and then just stay at home. Would you do that?
No,
I certainly wouldn't. You know, I value my paycheck and I value the input I give on a daily basis. You know, I
well,
value what I do.
I know someone that would really frown upon it, and that process is not going to be fun. So this will not happen.
Yeah, you know, 100%. But the point of my story is we as employees won't think twice about disobeying an HR policy because we will be reprimanded according to the severity of the offense. Why not the same for health and safety? You know,
Mm.
people neglect wearing PPE because, I don't want to wear my safety shoes today without even looking twice at the health and safety policy or the PPE policy. Why? Is that enforcement taking place? You know, and I'm siding here more to the employer side of it, but you know, we spoke about the employee side in the previous video, and the fact of the matter is enforcement needs to take place as well. If
Mm.
the Section 8, which we've now seen is appointed here, sees that this person is distracted or loses concentration after we've provided them with all of these control measures, some serious questions need to be asked. Don't you agree?
Yes, yes, no, absolutely. Look, I agree that
Mm.
every employee needs to take ownership and responsibility and accountability for their own safety.
100%.
Absolutely.
100%.
But I also agree to the point that that can only happen once the employer has done everything within their power
Sure.
to provide the employee with a safe place of work and safe processes of work, as far as
100%.
they can within reason.
And that's a legal
At least,
requirement. Remember, Section 37
yes,
says that. It says the employer
yes,
will always be held responsible and accountable for everything his employees do unless, and then it's those items you just said, he can provide that evidence, yeah.
yes. You see, and that at least is in the South African context.
Sure.
I'm quite interested to hear from viewers from the UK, India, the US, Canada,
Mm.
the rest of Europe, Australia, our African nations as well, in the Middle East and the Far East. How do they view, this level of responsibility and accountability? Because I'm quite interested to see how legislation would differ from one
Yeah.
country to the next. But ultimately, if you have an individual, irrespective of what country they're in, that takes ownership for themselves and ownership for the people that they work with, their
Mm.
colleagues, their peers, you have a safer workplace. Immediately, you have a safer workplace. Anybody that values health and safety and the control measures that they're using, realizing that if they apply them properly and they apply the processes properly,
Mhm.
that they have an opportunity to come back to work tomorrow, to get home to their partners or wives or children or husbands. That's an opportunity
Yeah.
to be able to continue to contribute to the economy and the community, and to carry on with life. I mean, you've asked the question now with regards to the employee responsibility. For me, it comes down to experience. A person that is not exposed or has never been exposed or has not experienced a severe incident,
Mm.
a traumatic, severe incident, would have a different view to a person that has
Sure.
regarding
100%, yeah.
that
Mhm.
regarding that activity or task or the danger itself. As soon as you go through that experience, your viewpoint changes.
Sure.
The problem is we can't have the entire workforce go through a traumatic accident where they get hurt and maybe dismembered
Sure.
before we can have them take health and safety seriously,
Yeah.
because then you're going to have an inefficient workforce.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's a realization that health and safety it's not just a management responsibility. Yes, it is also an employee responsibility, but the money being spent on these control measures and training people and buying personal protective equipment and putting up signage and developing policies and having training initiatives and wellness programs, whatever you can think of, all of those things are investments by the employer in their most important asset, which is their employees. You need to get the
Definitely.
employees to see it the right way as well.
It's a two-way street, okay, as you've now said, and we
Yes.
reiterated that previously. The employer needs to provide these things legally, but the employee needs to toe the line then. And if they don't, this is two ways, both to the employer and the employee, there needs to be consequences. Because if there are no consequences, the enforcement of this will fall flat. But
Yes.
hopefully it doesn't have to go that far. Remember, this is now worst case scenario. I'm playing devil's advocate with this regard. But if we look at these are all perceptions of both the employer and the employee, as you now rightfully said, for the person that was severely injured and an employee that's new at the company, their perceptions differ. And one of the main priorities that the employer needs to try and advocate for is that perception change. And if we can achieve that, the rest of the control measures are fairly simple. But that's easier said than done, right? Okay. So very interesting conversation on just behavioral hazards. And remember, behavioral hazards are very difficult to control because we are looking at perceptions, as we've now discussed. We are looking at people, their moods, their personal things. This is very difficult to control. Let's go on and have a look at what other hazards they have listed here for conducting a welding job. So again, a lot. There are a total of 11 behavioral hazards, just FYI. So here we can even look at poor housekeeping practices and so forth. Anyways, here's a fun one that we spoke about in the previous session as well. So points number 12, 13, 14 are all in regards to biological hazards. This is with regards to COVID-19, any bacterial or fungal infection. We had quite the interesting conversation regarding this. Is
Yes.
your standpoint still the same? Do you think
It
that
hasn't
these
changed.
you still think that these hazards are not applicable for this task?
Well, the applicability would need to be tested. I'd need
Mm-hmm.
to take the risk assessment, go on site, and go and check. The COVID test is an easy one because there is no pandemic at the moment.
Sure.
So if it was me, I would remove it. And if we look at the control measures, you've got the dust mask, you've got appointment
Yeah.
letters,
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 workplace inspection checklist,
Sure.
health and safety representative inspection checklist. So that's an additional inspection that needs to be done for something where there is no pandemic right now.
Yeah.
Conducting a welding job, general SOP, yes, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got a mandatory MV12 dust mask shall be worn. And if you scroll down a little bit, you've got another mask. So we're giving the individual two masks to wear, plus COVID-19 awareness training. So that's more time out of my day to do
Mm-hmm.
training, plus doing the inspection. I don't know how he's going to breathe when doing the
Well,
welding.
yeah. If you think about it, there's two masks, a welding helmet. It gets a bit much, right? And there's not even sanitizer on this list. Can you believe we have all these PPE, but not one singular hand sanitizer as a control measure?
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably the most effective way for COVID-19 to spread is when you make contact with
Sure.
surfaces that are infected,
Yeah,
but
100%.
or not infected that are, exposed to the virus. But I just don't see this as being relevant right now. In all practical terms, if I was a manager in a department and you brought me this risk assessment, with COVID-19 items
Mm.
on it, I'd say take them off.
Yeah.
I would.
No, I
If
agree.
if you brought me a risk assessment with other types of possible infectious diseases on them and the environment was different and I'm not necessarily performing welding activities, I may be working in the medical industry.
Sure.
That sounds
Yeah.
valid.
Yeah. 100%. No, I'm beginning to see your point here, okay. But again, the important bit here is to go out and see if this is really applicable. Go out and do a job safety analysis for this particular task and see, are biological hazards present while conducting this? I'm still of the opinion on point number 13, this might be a possibility, purely because of my personal, preferences and personal experience. I've seen this happen. So I believe.
Have you shared your personal protective equipment with others, Dylan?
Well, the only PPE I have currently are my safety shoes and my glasses, and I have not shared neither my shoes nor my glasses with anyone at this point in time.
Okay, I'm just checking. I'm just checking.
But the fact of the matter is, it does happen at various businesses, and I've seen this and experienced this with my own two eyes, if you want to call it that. So,
Hmm.
again, I'm not saying this is happening everywhere. In some instances, this might be not applicable, and then by all means, let's remove 12, 13, and 14 of a biological hazard perspective. But in my opinion, I still believe point 13 is valid and carries merit, purely for the fact that that is a niche hazard, and for that niche hazard, there will be niche, not appointments, but control measures in the form of specific communication. Don't share your PPE. Wash your hands after you've been in the bathroom, for example, type of situation. It's niche controls that I don't think will appear anywhere else on this assessment. But again, you'll have to go out and test it, see if it is applicable to you.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, I always love looking at the biological stuff. Anyway, moving on, let's go to chemical hazards. So we can see that there are a multitude of chemical hazards as well, all the way from 15 to point number 19. And let's have a look at the first one here. Chemical hazard, the person is exposed to contact with welding flux, sealants or adhesives while conducting a general welding job. I think that is a fair hazard statement. What do you think, Oki?
Well, sure. I suppose welding flux could be harmful. I'm
Sure.
quite interested to look at what the risk statement says there.
Okay, well, let's have a look. So the person makes contact with welding flux. Remember, that's the vapors that the welding gives off, especially on arc welding. Sealants or adhesives. I'm not too sure what they mean by sealants or adhesives here. Maybe this is when you weld a specific product or a specific item that makes use of these items. So, making contact with welding flux, sealants or adhesives used during welding process while conducting a general welding job, causing chemical contact of these items, resulting in external chemical irritation, skin reddening, and skin irritation. So the risk is not very severe, according to our methodology. If we look at the scoring here, they scored it a 3, maybe even a 2 in my opinion. I don't know. What do
Yes.
you think?
I would make that a 2
Sure.
to start with. And also considering in balance with the other control measures which would have to be applicable to this task, the welder would be wearing gloves.
Sure. Let's look at the controls while we're there.
So if the welder's wearing gloves,
Mm-hmm.
how do they make contact with the flux?
Remember, the flux might not necessarily come into contact with your hands. It's a vapor that you can inhale. The sealants or other forms of flux can be physical, but the majority is that hazardous vapor that the arc welding stick gives off. So I think that's what they're referring to in this specific example.
Okay.
So let's look at the controls. Do they even have, a dust mask or similar means in here? We have hand protection, that's fine. We have safety boots, that's fine. We have a overall, okay. So we are looking at PPE side of things, that's cool. We have behavioral controls, induction training, foot protection signs. These are just the signs. We have the SOP, Here we have a safety data sheet, but I can have the safety data sheet. What does that mean? What does that do for
Mm.
me? How does that mitigate this specific hazard? I don't know. And lastly, we have a section 8. I definitely feel there is room for improvement. Again, these are the examples that we just provide for this particular one, but there's definitely room for improvement here. There's no dust mask, although the dust mask or respiratory device will not stop the actual flux from happening. It will lessen the blow of it. We cannot take flux away. Welding cannot exist without flux. It's one of those things for specific welding types. So definitely room for improvement here. Okay, what else would you say we could possibly put as a control here?
Well, again, we've got the job safety analysis that has to be done. We've got the SOP in there already.
Yeah.
I would suggest for all hazards related to this task that you would need supervision and you would need a health and safety representative.
Mm-hmm.
You would need a first aider appointment. You may not need a firefighter for this specific hazard.
Yeah, for the specific one.
First aid equipment.
Mm-hmm.
If we're looking at skin irritation or maybe worse, what are we going to do to help the person? So, yeah, there's a couple that we could consider to add. There's not much that I would want to take away, though.
Yeah. So remember, the task in itself is conducting a welding job, which is a very generalized task, which could potentially consider multiple types of welding. Remember that we have an activity and we have tasks within that activity. So if we look at the task, it's welding. An activity within, or a task within that activity rather, might be, for example, to put in the rod with that, start welding, moving heavy equipment, and so forth. So this could be a very broad spectrum, and I would like to do an assessment more specific. Say arc welding, or TIG welding, or MIG welding for that example. And I think that would give us a better idea of what type of flux they talk about, because here we have ingestion, inhalation, we have exposure to welding fumes. These are all different types of hazards pertaining to different types of activities within welding operations. Okay, but from a control measure perspective, there's definitely some room for improvement there. Now, let's move on to electrical hazards. Let's have a look at what they say here. So the first electrical hazard is the person is exposed to coverless 3-point plugs while conducting a general welding job. Okay, general 3-point plugs. So the person makes contact with electrical wires of these 3-point plugs or nearby multi-plug extensions or connected equipment used to extend power for this welding machine. So fun fact, you can't really use an extension cord for welding if it's not a properly insulated and thick wire cable for welding, because welding creates a lot of friction when it draws that amount of power. So another tip here is, if you have to use an extension, don't use a roll-up extension, because the amount of power that is needed for that for the welder creates friction so much through that extension cord. The coil around the wind-up extension gets very hot, and that could cause it to melt. I've seen that happen with my own 2 eyes. Okay, anyway, coming back to the coverless contact here. So the person comes into contact with that while conducting the welding job, causing an electrical shock, resulting in electrical trauma, skin redness or swelling, possible loss of consciousness, and possible electrocution. And they scored this a 4.3 and a 4.1. Do you agree with that, Wookie?
So we're saying it's a coverless 3-point plug that's plugged in.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not a 3-point plug that's not plugged in. In other words, that is not connected. It's not live.
Yeah.
It's a live, plugged, coverless 3-point plug.
Yes.
All right. Again, I would just ask the question, do I have a maintenance team? Do I have coverless 3-point plugs in my workshop? If I have a zero tolerance policy towards the maintenance of my equipment and upkeep of my equipment, be it electrical or otherwise, and there are no coverless 3-point plugs, and we have a strict rule that any damaged or worn cables, extension cords, or plugs are to be destroyed, discarded properly, obviously.
Sure.
Then I would remove the hazard.
I fully agree, and that was just what I was about to say. If we look at one of the control measures here, they talk about isolation controls, which is relatively high up in the hierarchy, it's just below engineering controls. And if we look at the isolation control, here we have a cover in terms of general and electrical covers, which in this case could be the missing plug point or the missing cover for that plug point. In essence, if we do this, are we not theoretically mitigating that hazard entirely?
Well, I mean, I'm having the cover in place. That's first of all, that starts with the manufacturer.
Sure.
The manufacturer is not going to supply me with a coverless 3-point plug. And if the cover is removed for whatever reason, and if it should be either removed from the workshop, from the site, wherever it is, and if there's maintenance to be done on the cable, again, I would just go back and say, look, we don't adjust the lengths of our cables and fix our own plugs. Buy the equipment fit for purpose.
I
So that
agree.
if there's an issue with it, then you discard it, you get rid of it. And if it's an issue that you have due to the supply, in other words, it's a manufacturer's issue, then give it back to the manufacturer and have it replaced. If it was me, I would just be very strict around this type of hazard and say, well, we've got a zero tolerance policy with regards to issues like this. And if we find that there's a wire that's frayed or a plug with a loose connection, whatever it may be, or a cable with a loose connection, the cable is to be removed and replaced immediately.
I fully agree. And that again is where the policy and procedure comes into play. Because if we have a valid policy and procedure for, the general maintenance, for example, then that would be a section in the general maintenance policy where you talk about zero tolerance for any covers are missing or wires exposed or any links in wires, for example. But coming back to the question, if we do that and if we have that policy in place, do we remove this hazard completely from the risk assessment? In other words, do you feel confident in saying that if we implement that policy and that zero tolerance approach, will this hazard never exist again in that workplace?
It's not without or outside the realm of possibility that it will never happen. But
Sure.
in my experience and from what I've seen, employees would much rather work with new, fit for purpose equipment than they would struggle with equipment that is damaged or exposed, not in a great condition.
No, 100%.
There's a level of pride that comes with it as well. Again, if I have a zero tolerance policy and I do this risk assessment, which we're doing in theory, and I then go and test it in practice, and I actually go onto the premises and I go and check if there are any 3-point plugs with no covers, I will remove the hazard.
Okay.
I will, because it doesn't exist.
A valid point. My next question to you then is, if we look at this risk assessment as it stands currently, are we only listing hazards that are current in our workplace? Or do you feel that we need to include hazards on this risk assessment that might not be happening currently, but there is a potential for it to happen? And I think Sure, carry on.
No, go for it. No, go for it. Finish the question. Sorry.
The reason I ask this is if we have a look at accidents that happen, 9 times out of 10, if we only take the current hazards that are in place for a specific task and an accident happens, 9 times out of 10, that hazard wasn't considered on the risk assessment. So again, my question to you is it worthwhile to include hazards that are not happening currently, but could potentially happen with this specific task on this risk assessment Like, for example, the coverless 3-point plug. Zero tolerance, everything's nice and in place. There are no wireless or coverless plugs, for example, but it could happen. So what do you think?
Okay. So, the definition of an accident is an unforeseen, uncontrolled incident, which has taken place and
Yeah.
which has consequences attached to it.
Okay.
So I understand where your question is coming from,
Okay.
because if you have foreseen the hazard,
Mm-hmm.
and in this case, the exposed wires within the 3-point plug,
Sure.
it then becomes relatable to the questions surrounding the biological hazards as well. COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
fungi, bacteria. Well,
Indeed.
let's include the full spectrum of all
Sure.
possible communicable diseases. My question then
Mm.
to you, to counter your question, is how long is a piece of string?
True that.
Because
Does a tree make
if,
a sound if it falls in the woods? It's much of the same concept, you know.
the thing is, if we over control
Mm.
what maybe, possibly, at some point in time, something that may pose a danger, which isn't there yet, which isn't controlled
Yeah.
yet, or that possibly is under control and therefore doesn't exist right now, I just see a couple of things happening. First of all, if you over control completely, I don't know if the work's going to happen.
Sure.
I don't know how efficiently the work is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I don't know how profitable the business will be. I don't know how happy your employees will be.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time the health and safety representatives would have for their other work.
Mm-hmm.
The 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 ripple effect when over controlling without considering reasonable control is so large that, in fact, I think you are creating a very big opportunity for health and safety to be seen absolutely as a grudge purchase.
Yeah. 100%.
And everybody's going to hate it,
Yeah. No, for sure.
especially the employer who's paying the employees
Yeah.
and whose budget is now lopsided because there
Mm-hmm.
are millions being spent on health and safety initiatives, and we're not making money.
Mm.
The purpose of the business is to be profitable so that people can put bread on the table and come back tomorrow.
Of course.
So we can prosper, so we can grow, so we can give our kids opportunities. I'm taking it a lot further now than I think your question was intended for, but
Just a tad, yeah. But
just a tad.
it's fine.
But it's true. And
Mm.
the reverse of it is also true.
Mm.
And that is why we have My Safety Hub. That's why you and I are sitting here, is
Of course.
because mainly because of the reverse happening, where risk is under controlled.
Mm.
The perception around hazards and danger isn't clear.
Mm.
The understanding towards the applicability of controls governed by policies, procedures, and the structure behind that to make workplaces safer and make tasks like this safer isn't clear. And a lot of times, even when it's clear, it isn't being applied fully because those other justifications come out, which we've discussed in the previous episode,
Yeah.
where budget is an issue and time is an issue. Those are
Yeah.
usually the two big things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Budget doesn't have to be a problem if you
Mm.
think clearly about the hazards and the risks associated to the tasks in your workplace.
Mm.
And again, if I am able to eliminate the hazard of an exposed wire inside a 3-point plug because it doesn't have a cover by means of a policy
Mm.
which is applied and enforced throughout my business with my managers and supervisors carrying side cutters or a pair of pliers with them. And
Mm.
if they spot a worn cable or a plug whose cover has been damaged and fell off,
Yeah.
I would tell them, if you see it, you stop the work, you
Yeah.
unplug it, you cut it,
Yeah.
you throw it away, you go to the store, you get a
Yeah.
new cable, and you give it to the person doing the work and you say, enjoy your work.
Yeah,
I would
100%.
reprimand the individual that hasn't done it themselves yet,
Mm.
because why haven't they?
Yeah. No,
So
100%.
yes, it's about the applicability of control and the hierarchy of control. The most effective thing is elimination. If I can eliminate it with something as simple as a policy and a procedure, I would do
Mm.
it.
I agree.
Just get it done, and your risk assessment becomes shorter. The amount of effort that now has to go into these
Yeah.
control measures that you've listed here, not even to mention the others that we can come up with. You're saving money, you're saving time because you're removing the hazard. You're just making your life so much simpler.
Of course, and that links back to one of the very first statements when we started this session. As I said to you, there are 53, how much were there? 53 different hazards.
Yes.
Let's have a look here again. Look how long this list is. There are 53 different hazard statements for conducting a welding job. I can promise you by the time we get to number 53, the guy that does the welding is done with his job. you know? So again, I agree with your statement, and I just wanted to make that point clear, which is why I asked that question. Is we need to be reasonable when it comes to hazard identification and also control measure implementation, right? Remember, again, South African legislation says, as far as reasonably practicable. I'm again keen to hear what other countries might have to say about that, but if you have a solid foundation of policies and procedures and you have zero tolerances for a few things, theoretically, they should not become hazards. And the fact of the matter is, if the policy and procedures are executed quick enough and efficiently enough, they will be hazards for a very short amount of time, not to justify coming back on the risk assessment. So, yeah, I'm in full agreement there, Joachim. So, we have a few electrical hazards left here, and I think they all speak relatively to the same thing. They speak about electricity and the contact of electricity and the various ways that electricity can make contact with you. For example, plugs, electrical cords rather, ill-maintained DB boards and so forth. But let's move on to the next category here. And as we can see here, we have environmental hazards. Let's look at number 28. An environmental hazard in the form of the person exposed to constant noise from work operations while conducting a general welding job. Let me ask you first, before I deliver my opinion on this. What do you think about that hazard statement, keeping in mind the task at hand?
Well, welding itself doesn't make a lot of noise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, there are easy ways to test it, but this is about the work environment, right?
Yes.
So if this is in a loud workshop, automobile workshop where panel beating activities are taking place, it's very possible that the noise limit is being exceeded and that a person may need to do a few things about that.
Sure.
So that's fine. But for the task itself, I may be incorrect. Anybody out there, please leave a comment if you know about welding activities that exceed the noise limit. I'm keen to learn about it then. Um, but I think this is more related to the
Mm-hmm.
environment itself and that there are external third-party activities taking place that is
Yes.
exposing the welder to noise levels. So again, in your specific place of work, maybe the welding activity is taking place outside. There's no real noise. There's no banging on metal,
Yeah.
movements of machines that are really loud. In that case, again, if it doesn't exist, I'll take it off.
I fully agree. I think this one is very clear cut and very defined. If you're welding in a factory where there are giant presses or forklifts running up and down the whole day, or grinding taking place right next to you, in fabrication shops, sure, then there are noise. But if welding forms part of general maintenance in your regard, noise might not be a problem. And again, take it off. Because otherwise, look at all these control measures that we need to have a look at. So again, section 8. Then we have inspections, noise inspection checkers. Now we even have medicals. Now remember, if you have noise zones, medicals are good practice and in some instances mandatory to do medicals to see that your hearing is not deteriorating. Then
Yes.
further to that, we have hygiene surveys in the form of a noise survey. So if ever you are unsure of the noise level of your organization and whether or not medicals should be mandatory, you conduct a hygiene survey in the form of a noise assessment. And this will tell you what the noise levels are, where there are noise zones, and what control measures need to be followed, such as medicals, PPE, etc. The unfortunate bit about noise surveys and surveys in general is they are quite expensive.
Mm.
Will you be able to justify this specifically for welding operation? I don't think so. However, if again you are in a fabrication industry, this will definitely become applicable not only to this task or hazard, but to a multitude of other hazards and tasks. So then the justification will be there. SOP, we all know by this time, is a standard for every single task, every single hazard. We have our various safety signs such as hearing protection and noise zone. Again, now we're adding to that PPE list. Okay, remember now we have a dust mask, 2 dust masks, a face shield, and earplugs. Okay, so we're starting to get a bit overwhelmed here with PPE to just weld 2 pieces of steel together very quick.
Yes.
Then we have training, general health and safety induction. I'm a firm believer of induction training. I feel induction training sets the tone, it sets the foundation of the rest of these controls. So I'll always leave induction training in for various aspects. And then communication awareness, these are now your toolbox talks, etc., such as noise pollution, noise-induced hearing loss. And then on the PPE side of things, we have earplugs disposable or earplugs reusable, depending on your preference. It doesn't make specific provision to specific ear muffs or a category. It just says plugs reusable or disposable here.
Yes. Well, I mean, the thing there is if you leave both of them on,
You need to buy
your safe
both.
operating procedure is going to say that you need to wear 2
Yeah.
sets of earplugs, one disposable
Yes.
and one reusable. So one has to come off.
Yeah.
I'm in agreement with regards to the induction training for this specific hazard, because if the
Mhm.
work environment itself is a noisy work environment, you would have
Yes.
to cover the use of PPE in the induction training in any case.
Correct.
So I think it can stay on as well.
Mhm. But the fact of the matter is, and we start seeing a trend forming now, that with some of these things, yes, this control measure items on this, I am in agreement with. I don't think, besides the reusable and disposable ear protection, that any of this can be removed. Surveys is a must, and I can promise you, if you have a noise area, medicals will be a must, which means the checklist will be a must, and so on and so forth. So the controls selected here are very valid. But again, look at how many there are. So we need to be very specific with regards to this. But
Yes.
unfortunately, if you have a noise zone, this is what needs to happen. And I can tell you these are all valid and have merit to them, but that's not all. Here again, we don't have a health and safety rep appointment nor training. Just to name one thing over here, we don't have your management reviews or committee reviews of the specific hygiene survey. There's
Yes.
still a lot to be done with regards to this.
Oh yeah, you can definitely add to the list. Absolutely.
Okay, but a very solid list for this particular item. I don't have too much else to say on that, okay? Let's have a look then at some of the others. We have here again environment, we have temperatures, we have inadequate ventilation, poor lighting. I can tell you they are going to be all much of the same story, where we will need to do specific hygiene surveys. There we can see again, there's the hygiene survey for light, because we again need to prove that there's adequate lighting. That one again is subject to where you do the welding job, you know.
Mhm.
But they are all falling in line with the same concept when it comes to environment. But in any case, let's have a look at ergonomics, one of my personal favorite hazards, and this is with regards to person exposed to awkward postures during welding while conducting a general welding job. Now, out of experience, welders tend to put themselves in very awkward places and contort their body in very strange manners. I don't know if you've seen some welding operators weld upside down and
Yes.
across or barrel roll into a pipe or something. That happens. So I think this definitely has merit, irrespective if it's in a maintenance related environment or if in the fabrication. What do you think, Oki?
Well, I mean, it's part of the job. So the individual is going to be exposed to
Yeah.
some kind of strange posture, whether they are kneeling down repeatedly or hunching repeatedly or overreaching repeatedly, whatever the case may be.
Sure.
It's going to happen because you need to get to those difficult to reach places to fix whatever you're fixing.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, I mean, for me, the difficult part here is, or at least the important part, is looking at the probability rating.
Mm.
If this is an activity or a task that is not performed regularly,
Yeah.
I would score it lower down.
Yeah.
If this is a full-time activity that happens all the time, I would push the probability rating up to a 5.
Yeah, because it
Meaning
will happen, definitely.
it's happening. I mean,
Yeah,
if it's in my business and it's happening right now, then it's happening right now, right? You
sure.
can't tell me that a welder is not going to put himself or herself into a difficult body posture when performing this type of work. It's going to happen. So it's happening. And I would immediately push it up to a 5, and the severity rating would stay the same. Now look at your risk score.
That's where I'm heading with this. Do you feel?
Yeah,
Let's just have a look. I am in agreement with that. But here we have the severity, inflammation, and swelling, musculoskeletal related injuries, long-term musculoskeletal disorders. That is a 3. All right, out and out, I'm happy with a 3. But now this is on a high risk. My question to you now is is this acceptable? What else can we do?
well, you need to look at your method of work.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to look at administrative controls that provide the individual the opportunity to rest, to recover, so that your probability rating after control can come down because your exposure has gone down.
Mm-hmm.
If your frequency of exposure towards these awkward bodily positions is coming down because you are provided an opportunity to take a break while a
Sure.
colleague maybe takes over the activity and they carry on with the work, and we rotate the work, we rotate the activity. It's purely an administrative control, but you're giving the opportunity to the individual to rest for 15 minutes, or you rotate the type of work that they're doing.
Mm.
Then I think it could be more efficient. It's managing that which becomes a problem, and it's having sufficient number of staff members to be able to afford such a procedure. That's the difficult part. So if you don't have the manpower to be able to rotate the activities, you would have to plan the work properly so that you can limit the amount of exposure of the individual to these awkward bodily positions to what could be seen as a limit.
Sure.
And there's research available on this
Yeah.
where you can actually go and have a look online and see, what should be the exposure limit for poor bodily position when performing welding activities or other
Yeah.
activities as
Yeah.
well.
Sure. Now stats available. You know,
Yes, and
and
then you apply that to the work. It becomes
mm,
part of the SOP.
I agree. And ergonomic hazards are one of the most difficult to control. Besides behavior hazards, which we spoke about, which is the individuals and their perceptions of certain things, ergonomic also involves the individual. And as soon as people start getting involved, it is extremely important to put things in the hierarchy, such as an engineering control in place. Yes, it is possible, but not always. And 9 times out of 10, you will have that will happen, even with control measures. And that's a scary thought, that certain things are so inherent that they cannot be mitigated at their very core, which is ergonomical strain or awkward posture.
Yeah,
Maybe you can have table and put the object on a table. It depends. It depends on what type of welding you're performing. But the fact of the matter is, there will always be an opportunity for poor body posture. Not even in welding, but for everything. I can put my chair back and do a lean here, sit like this the whole day. That is ergonomic strain. If I don't stand up, if I don't do certain things, I will incur strain, and that's kind
yeah.
of a scary thought.
And well, you've also got to consider that, and you've mentioned now putting the object on a table. as soon as you change the method of work, let's use your example of placing my metal object on what I'm thinking in a workshop is probably going to be a metal surfaced
Yes.
table.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now I'm welding, and someone else comes and puts their hand on that table.
Yeah, look, there is risks associated with that.
Yeah,
Electrocution might not be one of them, but yes, I hear where you're going.
but
It creates a new
there
set.
might be other dangers as well. And that's the point,
Yes,
is
yeah.
that as soon as you consider trying to mitigate, whatever the hazard may be by changing the methodology related to the task, changing the procedure or the process of how the task is being performed, you've got to really look at your risk assessment again, and really think about what other types of exposures or
Yeah.
hazards have you created in the process, and not to be, how can I put it, sullied into thinking that I've changed the methodology, I've
It's
changed the
safer.
way in the work is being done, so
Yeah,
therefore I've created a safer task, and
yeah.
then be ignorant for the fact or possibility at least that you have created other possible forms of exposure to other individuals or yourself in the process. And now that's not included in your scope, in your
Yes.
risk assessments, and therefore you're not going to be thinking about that when you do a job safety analysis or when you communicate the SOP. Uh, and then you're
Yeah.
going to find that out later on.
I think that is a very valid point and something to keep in mind as well. Just to summarize that again, if you replace one thing with another, you are not eliminating all the hazards. You are, in essence, creating new ones. They might be safer than the previous one. Let me give you a practical example. If I substitute climbing on the roof with a ladder with climbing on the roof with scaffolding, I'm substituting the ladder for scaffolding. Does that eliminate height? No. Does it make the height work safer? Sure. Okay. So don't be ignorant in that regard. So a very valid point there, Oker. Thank you for that. Cool. Now, we had a look at ergonomical hazards. They are all much of the same thing with regards to different body postures, workstation design, repetitive motions, vibrations. These are all ergonomic strains, and some of them, as we've now seen, cannot really be mitigated as much as we would like. We then move on to another one, which is fire hazards. There are also a multitude of fire hazards here. And let's have a look at the first one. Person exposed to inadequate ventilation while conducting a general welding job. I don't know how that results in a fire hazard. Let's look at the risk. Maybe that gives us some more clarity. Poor ventilation in the welding area leads to the accumulation of combustible gases. Okay, got it. Or fumes which could come into contact with an ignition or heat source while conducting a general welding job, causing an uncontrolled fire, and all of these risks here up until multiple fatalities. What do you think
Well, it's
about
going to
this
cause
one?
it's going to cause an explosion. It won't
Sure.
necessarily just cause a fire.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, at the start, I was a little bit confused. I didn't
Oh,
understand how the two were relatable, but it makes more sense. And again, it just points to why it's important to define risk properly, like
yes.
this is done.
Mm-hmm.
But let's have a look at the controls then. So you've got health and
Sorry,
safety rep.
before we go to the controls, okay, I just want to point out here, let's have a look at the scoring. Here we can see this is scored a 4-3. The
Yeah,
probability, again, that's dependent on the working environment, but the severity is definitely incorrect here. If we have a
great.
look at our methodology, we know that multiple fatalities, as soon as we foresee multiple fatalities, that is a 5 on the severity scale, and that
Right.
cannot differ. Cool. So now we have here a very high risk activity at that, or a high risk hazard at the very least here. So let's have a look at these controls. Can actually drop this from a 5-3 to a 5-1. Okay. Okay, you were saying.
Right. So we've got your health and safety rep.
Yeah.
We've got some supervision in the section 8,
Mm-hmm.
health and safety rep inspection checklist, conducting welding job, general SOP, some signage,
Mm-hmm.
smoking prohibited, fire and open flames prohibited. Okay,
That's a bit difficult to do if you're welding, don't you think?
right.
Sure.
Um, But okay, I mean, there may be multiple welding activities taking place all at once. So,
Sure.
you know, maybe, and I mean, also open flames. You could even add non-smoking signs in here.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
no problem.
admin controls, general health and safety induction training, and then you've got communication awareness, fire safety. Right. So it's a fire hazard. There's no fire extinguisher. Fire extinguishers, multiple, possible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Where's the ventilation system?
well, exactly. If you have also, if you need a fire extinguisher, you need signage for the extinguisher.
Sure.
If you have a fire extinguisher, you need someone that's able to use it. Because if you provide something in the interest of health and safety, you got to train people on
Yeah,
how to use it, and therefore you would
of
need to
course.
have a firefighter.
Of course.
If you have a firefighter, the firefighter would need an appointment letter.
And an
If you have an
inspection.
appointment letter, you would have responsibilities, which would include the firefighter's inspection checklist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 5 or 6 different controls only related specifically to
The
the
firefighter.
reaction towards a fire.
Mm-hmm.
If they're able to do so, because if it's highly combustible gas
Mm-hmm.
and the explosion happens, I don't know if there would be any firefighters left. So
Sure.
why don't we do something about the ventilation?
Exactly. That's an engineering control which sits on top of the hierarchy. If you have more ventilation, theoretically, the accumulation of these combustible rather gases or fumes shouldn't be there. That's the whole point of the
It
ventilation
wouldn't
system.
happen.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, I mean, you can still have combustible gas due to a nature of work or a type of work or task
Sure.
being performed. But if you've got sufficient ventilation
Mm.
and fresh air that's moving about in the workspace, you've eliminated the hazard.
Yes,
Um,
and again, that brings us
it
to
may
one of our
still be
previous conversations.
hazardous. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the gas may still be hazardous, but now it's a different kind of hazard. Now it's more a chemical hazard
Yes.
because it's a chemical. But if you've got a workspace which is sufficiently ventilated,
Mm-hmm.
again, it goes back to that reasonable application. Is my workspace of such a nature that the accumulation of gas is impossible?
Yes.
Because we
Mm-hmm.
have these huge doors in my workshop where trucks are moving in and
Yeah.
out, and it's in the same space where the welding's happening.
Mm.
So it's not going to happen. I mean, we're not going to have this accumulation of gas, so take it off the risk assessment.
Sure.
On the
And
other hand, I mean, if it is happening, it's happening, but what are you doing to limit the buildup of the
mm.
gas, and to remove the person from the work environment? And if there's a buildup of gas, consider your personal protective equipment here as well.
Definitely, and if you seek verification of such, there is a hygiene survey for the testing of combustible gases, vapors, fumes within your workplace. So if you feel that my extraction system is up to standard and you want to remove this completely, do a survey. And if the survey's outcome says, well, you are within parameters, then that's no longer a hazard. That's how I see it.
I know. Well, it's also it can go the other way. If I'm
Well, yes,
working in
sure.
if
You know,
I
you
mean this
have
this can go
bias
anyway.
now. Yeah, sure.
But think
I'm with you.
if you've got if you've got a welder
Mm.
operating with a type of welding that causes a buildup of gas that may be combustible,
Mm.
doesn't that fall under confined space work or working in confined spaces,
Oh,
like
yes,
working in a vessel?
definitely. Definitely, yeah.
So now you need a second individual to work with a welder, with a lifeline.
Mm-hmm.
You need very specific personal protective equipment, breathing apparatus. You would need to introduce some form of manual ventilation to try and extract the gases as the work is happening.
Yeah.
There's a number of things that you would need to do to try and assist in getting this buildup to be mitigated or to be kept as low as possible.
Mm. I agree.
Yeah.
Again, that's the substitution, the ladder, and the scaffolding. It poses different risks, but it is, again, up to you as the user to go and see that is this actually applicable? Go do the JSA, the job safety analysis, and see, because if this is the case, the accumulation of gases and fumes, I don't even think of that. You're quite right. If there are accumulative fumes while conducting welding and it's caused by welding, that is a problem. Much larger so than we might have first anticipated. But
Yes.
an interesting thought to leave off with the fire hazard. Let's move on to, and again, the rest of the fire hazards, much of the same story: overheating of equipment, sparks and hot metal fragments, and so forth. Then we move to the last part, and I believe this is the second last hazard listed, is our physical hazards. These are physical things that could go wrong. So let's have a look here. A physical hazard in the form of the person rather exposed to falling objects while conducting a general welding job. Again, this is subjective to the working environment, but let's have a
Yes.
look at what this says. A person struck by falling items or tools due to falling or being knocked from workbench during welding processes while conducting a general welding job, resulting in all of these risks being realized. So, valid. I don't think the physical hazard itself is caused by the welding task. I think this is a subsequent hazard that is posed based on the environment the welding is taking place in. And again, if we look at the severity and probability, there we have possible fractures. I agree with the severity rating, minor or mild, 3, sure. If it's a common task, maybe in this person's case it was. So I'm happy with the risk scaling on this particular one. What do you think about that, Wilkert? I don't think there's much else to say. This is subjective to the working environment, as we've said.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a major incident. I mean, it depends on the tool that falls on you or the object that falls on you. I mean,
Sure, if it's a
it's
35-inch spanner, it's going to hurt.
yeah, and where it hits you matters. So
Sure.
yeah, it's definitely something that can be controlled and pushed down to a low risk type of hazard. We see the risk rating goes down to a 3 there. We've got clothing protection there for the individual, training, signage, overall shall be worn, foot protection against crushing, okay, shall be worn, that's fine. Induction training, foot protection, 2 types of boots, not going to hurt when it falls in his foot.
Yeah,
So,
2 types of boots on, yeah.
yes. But I mean, this for me is more about, other practices that need to be introduced. It relates to good housekeeping and the communication around housekeeping. You can elaborate on your signage. If you consider housekeeping practices as well,
Yeah,
you can have signage up that says, a tool in every place and a place for every tool. You know how that housekeeping thing
sure.
goes.
Place for
Um,
everything and everything in its place,
there
yeah.
we go. There we go.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, that's if you have good housekeeping practices, then this shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, we know that people are in a hurry and to get the job done, and this is how things go wrong. But I don't see much more we can add to this. Maybe a health and safety rep, because if we've got a health and safety rep in the area doing
Yeah.
inspections, they would notice that the tools are not put in their place and they can correct it immediately. Same goes for a supervisor appointment as well.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I think that is a lot lower risk and hazard as what some of the other items are. And again, it is subjective based on the working environment. Okay. The next few hazards are all regarding slip, trip and falls, poor work practices in workstations, wet or slippery flooring, poor housekeeping. These are all much of the same story that we've broken down into different categories because some of them require more things than others. So again, slippery floors might require a wet floor sign, whereas poor workstation areas like we've now seen might require housekeeping in general. So let's look at the slippery floor one and have a look here. Funnily enough, this one is scored a 4-3. And let's have a look why. So, slip, trip and fall hazard, person exposed to wet or slippery floor while welding or in the welding area while conducting a general welding job. Possible. I mean, cleaning takes place. Even in a warehouse environment, you need to mop the floors every once in a while, I'm sure. And this says the unwanted event, the person slips and falls on wet or slippery floor surfaces due to cleaning activities or spills while conducting a general welding job, causing uncontrolled falls, release, possible wrenching trauma, so on and so forth, possible fractures, temporary disablement, partial or complete, possible permanent disablement. So that's why they put it at a 4, because permanent disablement is what
Mm.
we call a very serious. So, okay, I see that. Um, and based on the consideration here, it's a 4. If we look at some of the ones previously where we have this here on this one, slip, trip, and fall, that is incorrect because there we also have permanent disablement, which is a 3. So in my opinion, the 4-1 is definitely the way to go here, because if you fall on your head and you are paralyzed, that is a very serious occurrence. And if they've foreseen that, the scoring, in my opinion, is correct. I don't know. Okay, what do you think?
No, I agree. It doesn't happen a lot, but every now and then you do hear these sad stories or about these
Mm.
sad cases where a person fell and they just, it sounds weird, but they just fell incorrectly and
Yeah,
hit the wrong part of their body and
yeah,
they're disabled.
yeah, yeah.
It's happened before, but it doesn't happen often. And
Mm.
again, that's where your probability rating comes in. It's the exposure. How often is the floor cleaned? With what is the floor cleaned? What is the surface of the floor like?
Yeah.
Is it a tiled surface? Is it a gravel surface? Is it a tar
Mm.
surface? What kind of surface are we looking at here? Obviously, if it's gravel, someone that's mopped the floor. Good luck with that. But
Well, never say never. If you saw one of our weekly review videos, we saw a guy scooping out water with an excavator and just dumping it right next to it, and
yeah,
water
I
flows
mean,
back.
stranger things have happened. I mean,
I'm
seriously. But
sure.
there's a couple of things that you can do here. You know, you can just cordon off the area that's being cleaned, and then move that along as you're cleaning it,
Mm.
if space allows that. Signage is obviously important.
Yes,
Having that wet floor, wet surface sign up where the cleaner is busy mopping the floor.
I agree.
Uh, wearing the right boots is important.
Sure.
Uh, From an engineering point of view, there's not much you can do
Mm.
unless you can afford one of those machines that actually cleans your floor with you, that cleans and dries it all at the same time, if you've got the
Sure.
money for it. Training would definitely be valuable.
Mm.
Part of induction training, absolutely, I think it would be part of that because it can also form part of housekeeping and being aware of your environment when at work. Um, Health and safety reps, definitely. First aider, definitely.
Yeah.
First aid box, definitely. So there's a number of things that you can do, but as a slip, trip, and fall hazard, unfortunately, slip, trip, and fall hazards are the most common types of hazards. They
Mm-hmm.
cause, I believe, the most type of incidents as well. That then relate to all kinds of issues afterwards. Musculoskeletal disorders, chronic back pain, fractures that need to be replaced. And
Yeah.
when you turn 65 or 70, you've got an issue. You've got a
Sure.
problem
It's true.
that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
It limits your well-being in the future, so it
Mm.
absolutely has to be addressed.
Definitely. I agree. Some very valid points there, Oki. Thank you for those insights. And then we move on to the last set of hazard statements in this regard, and this is regarding thermal hazards. Now, at this point in time, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but we talked about fire hazards. Are they not the same thing? And the fact of the matter is they are not. They both have to do with heat, sure enough, but the fire hazard is the result of a thermal hazard coming into contact with combustible material. Thermal hazards, on the other hand, are purely exposure to UV or heat or similar radiation means. And if we
Mm.
have a look here, for example, on 52, thermal hazard, the person is exposed to non-ionizing radiation while conducting a general welding job. Person is exposed to intense UV and IR radiation generated from welding processes while conducting a general welding job, causing radiation trauma resulting in burns such as first-degree burns, skin swelling, possible illness, and skin cancers. This is due to the UV. Okay, I'm going to ask you a very personal question now. Have you ever had arc eyes?
Yes, yes.
So this is where arc eyes come into play. And if you guys
Mhm.
watching this are welders, I'm pretty sure you know what that is.
Mhm.
If you
Mhm.
are not, arc eyes is essentially the thermal hazard of welding, that heat that is being emitted if you don't weld with welding goggles. It physically burns the first layer of your eye, causing a scratching, irritating, burning sensation. It's very, very sore. I personally have had archives myself, so talking out of experience here. So that's what we mean with thermal hazards. The control measures of such occur is very similar though to our fire hazards, however, with the emphasis on welding helmets, welding suits, and so forth to protect the user from that radiation.
And the curtain as well. I mean, to
Of course,
protect others.
a very
So
valid point, yes.
yeah.
Okay, so very similar to fire hazards, but specifically focused at the exposure to humans. So here we can see there's gloves, the PU soles, helmets, and then obviously the welding screens and everything. There's the welding curtain. Thank you very much. I was wondering where that was. So all of this, much of the same story. We had the conversation regarding some of these other ones, such as Section 8 appointment letters, supervising of the task, etc. So in closing for this task, Orkut, we have 53 different hazard and risk statements available here. I feel that a lot of them are very, very valid. Some of them might be circumstantial, but it is at least worth noting that and they're going to have a look to see if we can physically remove some of these hazards. And again, we look at scoring them appropriately and adding control measures to mitigate specific hazards, not the task as a whole.
Making sure and verifying what is valid, what is in existence, without being negligible. Because it's like you asked the question: do we simply control what's there? Do we control things that are not there yet? Having a reasonable outlook into the future and saying, well, it is very possible that some things may occur and may be present and therefore would have to be included into the risk assessment without kicking over the apple cart and simply just throwing everything in and over controlling the
Sure.
task to the point where the work isn't going to happen.
Mm.
And then simplifying the process and having conversations with the employees, the persons performing the work, and seeing how we can streamline the risk management process specific to the task to make it easier and safer at the same time. So, because if we can be efficient and safe, we're going to be profitable. If we're not going to be efficient, but we're safe, well, you're going to lose profit. If you're going to be efficient but unsafe, you're going to lose people, which means you're
Sure.
not going to be profitable either.
Yeah,
So
100%.
finding the balance in there is important, and that's why reviewing the risk assessment is so important, and especially those tasks that are high up on your risk assessment register on the list. And if your list is structured correctly, where you have your high risk activities at the top and your low risk activities at the bottom, having more frequent reviews and more frequent job safety analysis of those tasks at the top of the list would be beneficial for you, because it's most likely that those tasks, which are the high risk activities, are also the tasks that are related to the core of your business. And you need to look after those tasks, because if you look after your core activities or tasks in your business, then you're looking after the future of your business.
I
So I
figured.
would definitely place a much bigger emphasis on your high risk activities and review them more frequently, do more frequent job safety analysis, review the SOP more frequently, do more frequent communications around them. And in balance with that, not to neglect the low risk activities. They need to be exposed to the same processes of control measure checklists,
Sure.
SOP communication, control verification, job safety analysis, and then obviously doing the review if it's necessary. And if you follow those steps, along with the process of employing policies and procedures that are specific to these control measures, again, your governance towards making sure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And when you identify a gap, and trust me, you are going to identify gaps if you follow this process correctly. You have a policy and a procedure that tells you exactly what to do, how to implement that control measure, so you can keep someone safe.
Yeah. I agree.
Otherwise, your risk assessment once again just becomes a piece of paper that's filed somewhere.
It's a paper pushing
Carries
exercise.
Exactly, it carries no weight other than its actual weight.
Sure.
but it means nothing. It means nothing.
I agree. No, Ugur, thank you very much for your valuable insights once again today. Then, in closing, balance is key. Finding the right balance and the right proportions for risk management is an absolute necessity for a safer working environment. And then, for all the viewers out there, thank you very much for joining us once again. And as always, stay safe, stay inspired, and until next time, take care.